Welcome aboard the Bonnie Blue, a classic passenger yacht just leaving Elizabeth City, bound up the Pasquotank River. We're heading for the Intracoastal Waterway's Dismal Swamp Canal, the oldest continuously used man-made waterway in America. Beyond the canal is a dense curtain of green, reeds and vines, maples, white cedar and big pines, the eastern edge of the Great Dismal Swamp, now a 14,000-acre North Carolina state park and a 111,000-acre national wildlife refuge in both Carolina and Virginia. The canal looks little different to me now than it did when I was a boy. There's nothing about it to suggest that the canal at various times concerned Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, Jackson, the Union and Confederate armies, thousands of boatmen, timbermen, truck farmers, or that it was controversial in its inception, or that its construction dragged out over decades, or that it was a dangerous, somewhat debauched avenue. But it did, and it was. William Byrd first suggested digging a canal through the Great Dismal Swamp about 1730. He thought it should go through Lake Drummond in the center of the swamp. By the time Virginians like Washington, Jefferson, and Patrick Henry took up the cause, along with North Carolinians like Constitution signer Hugh Williamson, the plan was to cut the canal east of the huge lake. Virginia approved the Dismal Swamp Canal in 1787, North Carolina in 1790. In 1793, digging began, which canal historian A.C. Brown described as a slow nibbling process. Chopping roots, bailing water, sleeping in mud, everyone agreed canal digging was the hardest work in the American South. The digging, from both ends toward the middle, met and joined the Albemarle Sound with Chesapeake Bay in 1805. The canal, though, was little more than a muddy ditch, according to historian Brown. Only shingle flats floated over it in its earliest years. The canal needed more water to float boats of any size. On August 4, 1812, a sheriff's jury appraised a 300-foot by 3.5-mile strip of dismal swamplands at a penny an acre, and then condemned it in order that a small canal, the feeder ditch, could be dug to drain Lake Drummond's waters down into the main canal. In June of 1814, James Smith's 20-ton craft came down the Roanoke River from Scotland Neck, sailed out onto Albemarle Sound, made it up the Pasquotank River, thence north to Deep Creek and the south branch of the Elizabeth River. A big Carolina boat, now in Norfolk, bearing bacon and brandy. The first ship had made passage through the Dismal Swamp Canal. During the antebellum period, the Great Dismal Swamp was home to many hundreds of runaway slaves, some of whom made their ways north through this important point on the Underground Railroad. One of the most compelling stories from that era is that of Moses Grandy. Born a slave about 1786 in Camden County, he became one of the best boatmen this territory has ever known. When the War of 1812 broke out and the British blockaded Hampton Roads and closed Chesapeake Bay, the Dismal Swamp Canal became the way for moving goods into and out of the Norfolk area. Grandy took some canal boats on shares, and as Captain Grandy, he did well, never losing one stick of timber, not one piece of freight entrusted to him. He soon negotiated a price to buy his freedom, $600. When Grandy paid his owner the last of that $600, the man tore up all the receipts and then sold Grandy to another man for $600. Moses Grandy was still a slave. Another 2.5 years of boat work earned him another $600 to buy his freedom a second time. Yet his new owner's business failed, and Grandy served as payment for debt. He was no closer to freedom than the day he was born. Two good friends, outraged, bought Grandy and guaranteed him his freedom on repayment. And Grandy kept working the canal boats, paid his friends back, and his freedom was at last secured. 3 times it had taken him, $1,800, and many a year. It would be impossible to overstate this man's enormous spirit. Moses Grandy was a great captain on this old canal. On Election Day 1894, a love-sick, heartbroken young poet named Robert Frost set out by train from Massachusetts to New York City, then by steamer to Norfolk, Virginia, where he disembarked the next morning. After he'd had breakfast, all he would eat that day, he asked the way to the Dismal Swamp. He was on foot, dressed only in light clothing and a thin topcoat, and it was sundown before he saw the canal. The moon was nearly full, and Frost, fearful since childhood of the dark, trudged along toward the wilderness, stopping to lighten his grip by pitching out some clothes and a couple of books. What would he do? Dive in and drown in the cold waters of the canal? Walk off into the big swamp, there to lie starving against some gum tree none save he had ever seen? Somewhere between Deep Creek and the old Northwest Lock 10 miles to the south, it must have dawned on him that his romantic suicide would have no effect on its intended audience, his beloved Eleanor White, if his body were never found, and neither she nor anyone else ever heard about it. At Northwest Lock about midnight that night, he boarded a small steamer bound for Elizabeth City, where it lay docked most of the next day, awaiting a party of duck hunters. This boisterous, well-provisioned, liquor-swilling bunch swept him along with them to the old Nag's Head Hotel. "I was trying to throw my life away," he often said later, but instead, he walked and boated right on through the Great Dismal. Robert Frost's swamp adventure was over, and in time, he would win the two things, the want of which had driven him toward the dismal and death: Miss White as his wife, and the world's respect for him as a writer. One of the odder craft ever on the Dismal Swamp Canal was a lumber barge outfitted back in 1913 in Washington, North Carolina, down on the Pamlico River as a 700-seat showboat. 34 feet wide, 122 feet long, she drew only 14 inches, perfect for the Sound Country's shallow waters. The man behind it was a former circus aerialist, and the craft bore his name, the James Adams Floating Theater. The showboat lay up winters in Elizabeth City at the wharf just below Water Street. Come spring, James Adams' troupe would kick off the new season in Elizabeth City, and then a couple of 90-horse tugs, the Elk and the Trooper, would haul the showboat forth and they'd storm the Albemarle, playing Hertford, Edenton, Coleraine, Winton, Murfreesboro, Plymouth, and Columbia. The James Adams Floating Theater has the dramatic distinction of having come a cropper twice in the Intracoastal Waterway. It hit snags and sank right here in Turner's Cut in November 1929, again elsewhere on up the canal in 1937. So loyal was one old trooper, septuagenarian Pop Neal, that he stayed on stage during the 1929 disaster, never leaving the watery boards once in 2 weeks, and only coming ashore when the floating theater was finally raised and righted. On this aquatic venue in 1924, Edna Ferber spent a week doing research for a novel. She said there was plenty of dramatic tension. The partying actors and actresses kept the tugboat crews awake half the night, and then by day, the boatmen calling back and forth didn't let the performers get much sleep. Ferber titled her backstage love story Showboat. And though she set it on the Mississippi, it was really the Pamlico and the Pasquotank and the Dismal Swamp Canal that floated the boat, that caused the book, that inspired the 1927 musical and Jerome Kern's enduring ballad, Old Man River. Take it, boys.